With my own tracks, I rarely, when I finish them and send them off to labels, I don't really do that much mixing to them. I mean, mixing in the sense of like surgical EQing and stuff like that. Usually what I do is like I'll just level things out. So it's, I really do believe in just volume fader mixing and very minimal EQ. And then any other EQing is really for creative purposes.
You're listening to the Inside the Mix podcast with your host, Marc Matthews.
Hey folks, welcome back or welcome to Inside the Mix. Today I'm joined by musician, producer, composer, sound designer and label manager John Kunkel, also known as John Grand. John, welcome. How are you and thanks for joining me?
Great. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, great. I've been looking forward to speaking to you on the podcast, which I'll go through in a minute. Just for the audience listening, where are you joining from?
I am joining from Redlands, California. So that's about an hour east or so from LA, basically. So
Nice.
Yeah, right in the heart of SoCal.
Love it, love it. This is a classic British conversation. What is the weather like where you are at the moment? Is it sunny?
It's beautiful right now. It's like a good crisp 80 or something like that. But
Wow.
it was pretty hot for the last month or so. Like a pretty big heat wave's been out here. So yeah, it's been warm.
Nice, man. The reason I asked, I walked to the studio just to record this today, and it's like torrential rain here. So if you're watching this on YouTube, folks, and it looks like I'm sweating, I'm not. It's because my hoodie got wet when I was walking over. If it got wet through my coat, so it is not like nasty sweat patches. But I don't think you can see them anyway. But yeah, cool. Southern California. I get more and more Americans. You know what? I'm well overdue like a trip to the States, and it'd be great to just go visit all the people I've spoken to on the podcast. It'd be a really cool road trip and like do the interviews in person. That's like podcast bucket list. At some
Yeah,
point,
you'd
I
have to
reckon.
drive a lot probably because it's such
Yeah.
a big area,
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
if you don't have a car, you're screwed.
Oh, 100%, man. I say blessed. The traffic over here in the UK is terrible, but then again, you can get like London for me is like 2 hours, and I chat to people in the States, and they're like, "Oh, that's easy. I do that every day." And I'm like,
Yeah,
"What?"
there's people that I know that drive at least 2.5 hours a day, for work or whatever, and it's insane. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%, man. So I did touch on a story then that I was going to go through. So it's kind of like a full circle story, if you will. Audience listening, if you know, I've been releasing tunes for a while, and recently I've delved into the realms of progressive and melodic house. And that started, I reckon, around this time last year, maybe a bit later. And the tutorial that inspired me to do that was John's Splice tutorial, how to make progressive house from start to finish. And I'll put a link to that in the episode description. And I went through that, and off the back of that, I released a tune called Waves. Again, I'll put that in the description. So it inspired me to do that. And then fast forward 12 months, and thanks to a recommendation from Michael Oakley, who you might remember from episode 207, I now get the chance to sit down with John himself. So he provided the warm introduction for me. He recommended me to talk to John, gave me the warm introduction, and then I put the two together that, okay, it was John who inspired me to go down this route that I've been down over the last 12 months, which is like serendipity right there. So it's quite a cool little story, and it kind of 12 months, and then finally get to meet the individual who inspired me to move into progressive house, which is quite cool.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, it's again, audience listening, if you are interested in that, just go check out that tutorial because it's really, really cool. So if you're not familiar with John, so I mentioned John Grand as an alias. He began making music at 13, fronted the critically acclaimed synth band The New Division, and in 2015 launched his John Grand alias, focusing on progressive house, trance and techno. Beyond his artist projects, John has designed sounds for Sample Magic and Splice, hence the tutorial, and published with West One Music Group, Dynamic Music, and Sony. I know I get tongue-tied at some point. It always does with these intros. So this episode, I mentioned it at the beginning there. We're looking at sort of creating songs faster, streamlining the process. So what's in it for you? Workflow hacks to help you save time and produce more efficiently, fresh sound design ideas to spark creativity, and strategies to finish music while keeping the process fun and inspiring. So I think, again, that tutorial kind of inspired this again. So I think it'd be quite cool to start with workflow optimization and efficiency. So imagine you sat there, and when you sit down to produce, what's your process for getting into an efficient flow? What's your process to get into flow state for producing?
Man, well, I mean, that's the beauty of it. There's so many ways to go about it, but I think the most effective way for me is to find a track that I'm just really into, that I'm vibing with, that I've been like playing nonstop. I grab that track, I stick it into Ableton or whatever DAW you want to stick it into, and then I just start copying the arrangement. I think that otherwise I'm just fiddling around, for 4 to 8 bars or 16 bars, and then once I have an idea, then I start building it out. But having that reference track is so important because it really does make it feel more achievable to do something or at least achieving something similar like the track you love, right? So I think a lot of it is just a mental game, right? When you're able to see the full picture of something, you're able to sort of build out those Lego building blocks, and you kind of know exactly where you're starting, where you're finishing your track. And it's also just like inspirational to see that it's not just this hidden magic, right? It's literally right in front of you. Every piece, every component of that track you can dial into, solo it. I mean, now you even got stem separation. So if you wanted to go and stem separate parts to really hear how they're making those sounds, I think that's helpful as well, which I don't really do, but it's just really a great way to kind of get yourself in the zone without feeling overwhelmed of like, well, now I got to figure out where this track is going to go and which part is the breakdown. Like, if that track was successful, your reference track, and it's done well, then you also have a good shot of creating another successful track because of the example that you're following.
Yeah, wise words. And it's I got that from that again, referencing that tutorial again, but I took that away from that, and it's something that I've done now for the last 12 months because it makes perfect sense, right? Because I know what it's like to sit there with a DAW open in front of you and it's a blank canvas, and it can be quite daunting, specifically if you're trying to find that motivation. So having that reference track and breaking it down in terms of section by section really does work, and it's helped me no end in the last 12 months, and it's something I do. And it's interesting you mentioned about the stem splitter function as well, because I did that recently because there was a particular build going into the drop, and I thought, you know what, I've got Logic, I'll use a stem separator, break it down so I can properly sort of analyze and go in and see what's happening there. And it does make it infinitely quicker, I find. It's certainly sped up my process when it comes to actually getting an idea down that's workable and something I want to continue working on. So on the flip side of that, do you ever do it the other way and not have a reference track, or is that just something that just doesn't suit your workflow?
I do, yeah. I mean, I'd say the bulk of the music that I've ever done was without a reference track. That was something that I only started doing probably a couple of years ago, where I was like, this is like a big unlock, This was something that really helped me accelerate my production timeline, from being able to start a song to finish the song. Whereas before, it probably would have taken me a couple of weeks, just doing it off of muscle memory and then counting bars and all this stuff, and then going back and forth with labels and them saying, oh, this bridge is too long or this breakdown is too long, you need to cut it down. I was like, well, why would I keep having these problems when I can just go and look at the tracks that they recently signed, and then I could get 10 reference tracks and then see, examples of each one. Like, oh, this one has this length, this one has that length. I could probably do something with one of those examples and then go from there. But, there's still times where I'll just go in completely, as they say, raw dogging it without any sort of reference and just, go ham on it. But that's usually if I have a lot of time on my hands, right? If I got like a full day and I got 8 hours to kill, then sure, I'll go ahead and try something, just having fun and doing that. But the reality is I don't have 8 hours to kill to make tracks. I might have 1 or 2 hours a day where I can really zone in. And so the quickest shortcut to doing that is to have that reference track. Or the other thing I do is I just have created a bunch of templates based off of reference tracks that I love. And then I can just open one of those and use that as a blank canvas, right? So I already have my drums laid out. I have my arrangement markers laid out. I might even have mixing chains on each one of the different buses laid out. So I already know that like all I got to worry about is vibe and melody and progression. And the rest is kind of like, oh, I got to swap out that kick, or I got to change that hi-hat, or I got to do this, or,
Yeah, kind of removing all the friction to like that creative process, the vibe, as you mentioned there, and like achieving that sort of vibe that you want to use. And it's, I think I had this discussion with Michael actually, because he's been on the podcast twice. So the first time he was on, we were discussing his workflow and how he follows a similar process in that he'll have, let's say, Serum or Diva, and then have the favorited bass patches that he wants to use and use those just to kickstart that creative process.
Yeah.
So you're not spending an hour trying to find the perfect bass, or spending a couple hours trying to find the perfect snare, which you might whip out in the long run anyway because it doesn't suit the mix overall. But going back to that reference track, say you've started a song, you're using the reference, you've mapped it out and whatnot. Do you use the same reference when it comes to the mixing stage and the mastering stage? Or
Yeah,
does it
usually
change?
it depends if it's in the same key. So I'll always reference something in the same key of the track that I'm working in. So if I'm working on a track in G minor, I'm going to reference a track in G minor because when I look at the frequency spectrum of the reference track, I want to be able to compare it accurately to my track for mixing. Because, the most fundamental parts of a mix are usually going to be the low end, right? So I want to make sure that like my first octave bass, my sub is aligned with the reference, my second octave bass, my third octave bass. And it's not so much that you're using that as like it needs to match exactly what that track is doing energy wise or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's a good way to be able to get yourself closer to a ballpark mix that will translate most likely very well across several systems because you're already using that reference track as your North Star. And so you can use that track's frequency spectrum and use things like matching EQ analyzers, all sorts of different techniques to be able to get a mix that will sound as close as possible to that club track or to that, North Star track that you're, vibing with. And it also just creates consistency across your mixes. So if you're working on like an album, for instance, right, having those different reference tracks, that's the other thing too, is that like you have to be very selective as well with your reference tracks, right? Like you don't want something that's like a 90s house reference track versus like a house track that was just, released yesterday. Completely different mixing techniques, completely different, mixing spectrums and whatnot. So choosing your reference track is also super important.
Yeah, those words echo a conversation I had on the podcast, a couple I've had on this year. One with Shane Slack, get his name right, earlier this year, and he said the same thing to find a track in the same key. And I think Eric Mitchell as well, mastering engineer, said a similar thing. So it's a recurring theme of the podcast this year with regards to references, because I've been banging on about references now probably since this is like the 5th year of the podcast, but only this year has it really sort of come to light with regards to actually finding a reference in the same key as well, which is, from what I can gather from the feedback I've had on the podcast, is often overlooked. So it's a very important tip. So moving on slightly now, what would you say, I was going to say the biggest mistake, it sounds quite negative, but maybe the biggest mistake or challenge you see producers make that slows them down?
I think the number one is the sound selection, and this goes into sound design as well, but your track is only going to sound as good as the choices that you make in sound selection, So, the way I like to think about it is if you're painting a canvas, right, and you have paint that is from this brand, and then you have paint that is from this other brand, and maybe one of those brands is like less quality than the other one, or maybe they're actually not really compatible because of the material that they're using, right? That is going to massively affect how the end result will sound. So your, ultimately production and songwriting and creation, at least when it comes to electronic music, really comes down to the choices and decisions that you make sonically. So whatever you're picking, whether it be a kick, hi-hat, bass, all of that is going to come together and create this sort of, bigger picture. And if one of those elements is off or not the ideal sound, then the track isn't going to sound well. And so the biggest mistake that I see most producers make is they just kind of go for whatever they think sounds good in isolation, but maybe not in context with each other. So that could mean that, you're going to have to make some trade-offs. Like you may really like this bass preset, but that bass preset is potentially what is ruining your entire song. And when you swap that bass preset out, and maybe you just sound design something from scratch that's just a simple sine wave or a simple saw wave with a couple of voices, that could be the thing that makes or breaks your track. And so, I oftentimes, and I do a lot of coaching with different producers that are up and coming or that are just trying to learn how to sound design or just learning how to produce. 90% of the time when I hear the tracks that they're working on, the first thing that I notice is just the sounds that they picked are just really bad quality. Or maybe they are high quality, but they're incompatible with one another.
Yeah, wise words. Would you also say that, or rather, do you ever experience where you maybe find a mix engineer or producer is having problems with a mix, and maybe it's EQ or compression or something that's just not quite sitting right, and it actually turns out it is, like you said, it is just a poor choice, and they need to whip out that sample and bring another one in or use a different patch versus reaching for an EQ or compression or saturation or something along those lines?
1,000%. One of the things that I try to do with my students is to teach them to not do any mixing until they are at the 99% stage of production, meaning that most really well done productions don't really require hardly any mixing. That means EQing, compression. There might be some things like high passing and stuff like that, but if you can get to a really solid mix without having to do hardly any processing, then you're already, that means that everything that you've selected up to that point is compatible with each other, or it's sounding good. Now, the way I see mixing is really more like a way to accentuate those sounds or to bring those sounds either more forward to the front. So I don't really see it as like, I don't really see mixing as like a surgical exercise. I see it more as like a highlighting exercise of like, you know what, I think this pad or this synth is lead, so I want to add a little bit more top end, or I want to add a little bit more overdrive to it to kind of like richen it out. But I with my own tracks, I rarely, when I finish them and send them off to labels, I don't really do that much mixing to them. I mean, mixing in the sense of like surgical EQing and stuff like that. Usually what I do is like, I'll just level things out. So it's, I really do believe in just volume fader mixing and very minimal EQ. And then any other EQing is really for creative purposes.
Yeah, it's quite a refreshing take on it, to be fair, because I think, again, with the podcast and speaking to the listeners and whatnot, I think it can be quite easy to fall into over mixing, over processing, and just doing something because that's what you've seen online. You see all these, you see tutorials, etc. online, and they say do the X, Y, Z to get this vocal particular sound and whatnot on a vocal or a kick or anything along those lines. And I think you can just go down a rabbit hole of just over processing, where realistically, less is more.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's the important thing, is that people will sometimes think that, well, I just added a reverb and then I did some EQ and then I did this and compression as mixing. I would argue that's not mixing, that's production. You're trying to arrive at a certain sonic sound. Mixing is really just about making sure that everything flows well together. So that's why I always tell, the students and stuff that, like, if you're producing and you're doing EQ and you're adding compression and you're doing all this stuff, you're really still producing. You're not really mixing at that stage, because mixing is going to be like, I got everything printed out, potentially. They're all lined up in, the session. And I'm just really trying to make sure that everything is bouncing well together, leveling out, particularly for dance music. You really don't have to do a whole lot if your sound choices are good. And a lot of times the reason why people overmix is because they made bad production choices. And so that's why they end up having to do all these crazy things to make the track sound good, because they ended up over phasing something, or they ended up adding too much reverb, or they ended up, their ping pong delay is just like going so stereo that like they think, oh no, I got to fix this other thing. And in reality, oh, your ping pong delay is just taking up the entire stereo image. That's what's happening. So those are production decisions that end up in people's minds thinking that, I got to fix the mix now, which, so.
Yeah. It's a common thread, I would say, having done this podcast now for 5 years, a very, very much a common thread. So moving into like sound design. So we've touched on it a bit here. This is an interesting question. Do you think every producer should dive into synthesis? Should you have like a basic understanding? I guess specifically in the realm of music that you operate within, or is focusing on presets and samples enough? Can you get away with... Get away is the wrong phrase, because you don't really want to be like making music and just getting away with it, in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally possible for somebody not to have any sort of sound design, synthesis sort of knowledge, but I do think that it opens up a lot of doors. And I think that if there's a sound that you hear in your head and you don't want to spend an hour looking for the right preset for it, and you can just make it yourself, then that's pretty powerful. You could save yourself an hour. So, again, I'm all about efficiency when it comes down to workflow. If you have that skill set, it's kind of like saying, like, would you want to just rely on MIDI, or would you want to be a really good keyboard player or piano player, right? Like, I think you would always want to be able to play keys really well, which I don't. I suck at playing keys. And so it's
Same.
like I have to rely on a lot of like MIDI work and, kind of like Aviciiing it where I'm pretty much 90% in the piano roll, right? So would I would like to have that ability 1,000%. And I think for sound design, it's the same thing. It's a really good extra have, but it's not, essential necessarily. And that's proven by thousands of producers who just, rely on presets, and they do very well for themselves.
Yeah, I'm the same. I'm a guitarist, so I could play
Yeah,
guitar.
me too.
But playing piano, I think I tried, for whatever reason, I thought I was listening to a track and I was just like, oh, I'm going to try and play that piano track. And then I sat down, I was like, yeah, I can't play piano. What made me think I could just sit down and just bust out this piano piece? But I'm very much the same. I piano roll and then trying to humanize it with velocity and timing and
Exactly.
whatnot. Definitely down that route. If you're starting out, you want to get into sound design and synthesis, can you recommend a synth to start with, a VST?
Well, I mean, I think Serum is a great one because you can really see and visualize, what's happening under the hood. I mean, that was kind of the reason why it was built, is because, Steve Duda didn't like how Massive, which was another synth by Native Instruments, kind of had similar functionality, but everything was not visible to the person designing the presets, right? So with Serum, it's really well laid out for you to be able to see exactly what's happening when you do, a movement of a knob or anything like that. You can also see like different wavetables, which are sort of like the bread and butter inside of Serum of sound design. And it's a really powerful synth, Serum 2 particularly, I've been a really big fan of it, and I've already made like 500 presets for it since it came out. And it's incredibly powerful. If you want something a bit on the lighter side, I would recommend people start with something like Spire. Very easy to sound design with. It's got, I think, 3 or 4 oscillators. And just, watch a couple of tutorials. It's really not rocket science. It's not difficult to wrap your head around if you dedicate time to it.
Yeah, I'm a Serum user. I've been using it now for the last 18 months, and I'm a Massive user as well. I use Massive less now that I've got Serum. And there's another one as well. I cannot remember the name of it, and it's great for sound design. It's gone. It's Arturia Pigments. That's the one I was thinking of.
Yeah. Pigments is really good too.
Yeah.
That's another good one.
Yeah, I use Pigments a lot when it comes to, if I want just like really weird, like atonal or like just random sounds. I often reach for Pigments. But another really cool, I think I'm probably due updating it, to be fair. But I've never used Spire. Is that a paid for? Or is that a free?
It's a paid synth.
It's paid
by this company called Reveal Sound, and I've used it on nearly every single track that I've ever done since it came out. It's just a very lightweight, not super CPU hungry synth, and I use it for bread and butter sounds. So if I just want like a really simple bass to kind of layer under, or if I want to widen another synth by layering, I'll drop in Spire quite a bit. Another one that I'm really, really into is Nexus, which is probably my favorite synth. Nexus 5. I think it's just got so many options, and I think it sounds objectively better than Serum potentially. But Serum is just sort of like everyone's go-to, and there's a lot of great presets for it. But Nexus, in my opinion, is just so powerful. It's kind of like Omnisphere on crack. It's just got like, and it's actually for how powerful it is, it's very lightweight as well. You can run several instances of it before your sessions start kind of crackling or anything.
Yeah, I found that with Massive. I remember before I had my Mac Studio and I was using Massive, and I've had a few instances of that, and it was just like, no, you can stop. You're not doing any more of that. But thankfully, I don't have that now. But I think Nexus will love that soundbite, that description of you of Omnisphere on crack.
Oh man, I would highly recommend it. I mean, it does cost a lot, and the expansion banks are expensive, but they're definitely worth it. And they teach you a lot about just how they get those signature sounds. And there's a couple of banks that I like the Armin van Buuren bank is really nice, the Kashmir bank, and there's a bunch of melodic techno ones that I find to be really inspiring.
It's nice. There you go, folks. Do go. I'll find links to all those. Do go check them out in the episode show notes. So you'll find that in the links for this episode. So I think it'd be nice now to move on to the sort of the creative process and results stage, let's say, of like creation. So I often ask this question to individuals, whether it's production, mixing, or mastering. But from your experience, how do you know when a track is finished? Let's go from the production side of things before mixing. How do you know when a track is finished?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really up to every producer to decide. I think it's quite easy to overdo a track, and I'm definitely guilty of that, thinking that I need to add just, keep layering and adding more and more and more. So I don't know that I necessarily have an answer as to how do you know when it's finished. I think you just kind of know, and you're like, this is it. Like, I don't need to do any more work to it. So I kind of lean these days more towards not oversaturating a track and just focusing a lot on automation versus just adding more and more and more stuff to it, right? Like, I'm a big Eric Prydz fan, and so one of the things that I've always noticed that he does is he doesn't really have thousands of sounds in his tracks. He just has a few core elements, and those are always evolving, whether it's via volume automation or interesting effects and stuff like that. So I'm definitely a big fan of that now, and so I think that's also helped me finish tracks quicker, is not having to think about constant adding more and more and more. Like, I'm actually really against that these days. I now work with some people that I won't mention that are very much about like adding layers and layers and layers, and then I'll be on a mixing session with them and they'll say, do you think I should bring that 18th synth up a little bit? And I'm like, well, I didn't even know it was there. I had to go and solo it. So there's just stuff like that where it's really easy for you to get into your head that you need to keep adding stuff to finish the track, when in reality it was probably finished 10 sessions ago.
Yeah. It's really interesting you mentioned there about the individual who was asking about that particular sound and whether or not they should bring it up in the mix. And I experienced that just recently as well. I was working on a project for someone, and I gave them some feedback, and I was just like, you got all these sounds which I'm mixing, and I don't think you need. I was at the mixing stage, and I didn't want to put a producer hat on because that wasn't my role. But I was kind of like, you've got all these, and they're just competing for space, and some of them you can't hear, but it happens, doesn't it? And I really like what you said there about, rather than adding more, use automation, move things with regards to volume, with regards to stereo placement, or whether it's automating EQ or something along those lines. So I really like that approach, and I think it's really, really, really good.
Yeah, and I think it's important for producers and artists to understand a little bit of like how psychology works when you listen to music. The brain can only process X amount of information. So, when you start adding things over and over and over, it eventually becomes a wall of sound, right? And so the brain has to try to, make sense of that information in the best way it can. And if the brain is telling you add more, that usually might mean that you need to just probably step away from the track and then, give it to someone else and let them hear it, and then ask them, do you think this needs more or not? Instead of just like working in a silo and then just, layering stuff, because, again, like your ears and your brain can only process X amount of sounds, within it's kind of like if you're watching a movie and you try to put in 4 or 5 scenes into one clip at the same time. Like, would you know what is happening? You probably wouldn't, because even if you had like an opacity layer and you could see all like the different scenes happening at the same time, your eyes wouldn't be able to process what's going on. And it's the same thing with music, right? Whatever the central theme of your track is, that should be the full focus of that section or of the drop or anything else. And all the other stuff really just takes a backdrop. And yeah, there's going to be people that are going to be like, oh, that snare is sick, or that bass tone is great. But what the vibe of the track, those things just, add to the vibe of the track. They don't necessarily like take over the front stage. So I think it's always important to remember that.
What you mentioned there about the sort of the analogy using the film is really good. Never thought of it that way. So I think, audience listening, if you ever are in that position whereby you're sort of second guessing yourself, think of it in that context that John mentioned there about the central theme, and do you want all these subplots, all these side quests going on at the same time? Can you comprehend, or are you exhausting your cognitive load? And one thing I've done more often than not lately, probably for the last 18 months now, because Hands in the air, I was one of those individuals that at one point would throw the kitchen sink at stuff. And then I listened back to some early things and I'm like, what was I thinking there? Why have I got so much going on there? I learned the hard way. Now it's through that feedback loop as well that I experienced that. So you mentioned there about sending it to someone else and getting that feedback, and an individual coming back and saying, actually, have you considered just stripping it back and removing elements rather than adding more? So it really does make a difference. It's wise words.
Yeah, and I think that, kind of going off of that topic of the psychology of it too, I think there's also an element that I've noticed from, having worked with people on a coaching level is that the more that you add to a track usually shows that you're not confident with the ideas that you began with. And so it's almost a way to mask what you don't feel comfortable with. And so a lot of times being a good producer is being confident in your decisions and knowing that whatever you're adding into is good enough. And if it's not good enough, then adding more things to it isn't going to mask your confidence. In other words, good productions come from confident producers, in my opinion. I really do believe that to be true. I think that if you're, and again, like confidence is something that takes practice, right? There's false confidence, which is someone who comes in, he's like, oh, I just made this track and I added all this stuff to it. And then you hear it and it sounds terrible, right? That's what I would call like false confidence. But, actual real confidence is sort of like this position where you're going into a track and you might have to spend a lot of time getting there. It may not be quick. You might not be able to get that idea for a day or a week or whatever, but eventually you're going to arrive at something where you have so much confidence that like, this is good. And I don't need to put 15 layers under it for it to sound good, right? And so, yeah, that's sort of like another thing that I think is really important for people to remember is that like, if you're starting to see yourself add a bunch of layers to stuff to make something sound good, then you weren't originally comfortable with the first idea that you had. And that could even be not even on a sound design level. That could just be like your melody sucks. So you're just trying to like make it sound good, even though the original melody is not great to begin with. It's kind of like polishing a turd, right? As they say.
Yeah. Making, as we say over here, a silk purse out of a sow's ear, I think is one of the phrases that comes to mind. I don't know if that translates in the US. It might do. I think it does. But it's one that we say a lot over here. But it makes perfect sense. There's an audience challenge here. So I've got a challenge for you guys listening. So pick one unfinished track from your hard drive and commit to finishing it. I've got this week. I mean, obviously, you can do it 7 days if you want with a stripped down approach. So cut all the fluff, focus on the essentials, and get that track finished based on the sort of discussion that John and I have had here today in this episode. John, it's been an absolute pleasure. There's loads of this. I appreciate we're at 35 minutes already. And I did say I very rarely get through all the questions that I have. And what I've got written down, this always happens. But I think it'd be great if you could maybe talk a bit about what you're up to and also where the audience can find you online if they want to learn more about you and what you're up. Well,
yeah, so I am putting out a John Grand album pretty soon, and then I just started a new project with my bandmate Alex Gonzalez he's in another band, really great band called Matte Black. They do industrial and sort of like darker kind of music, but we just started a techno project called Unterstrom. So I'm kind of putting most of my energies into that lately, and then still doing New Division stuff. Just did an EP that's coming out next month. And then, just, constantly doing sound design, producing, mixing and mastering friends and family and other people out there. So you can find me on Instagram at John Grand Official. You can follow Unterstrom, which is, like I said, more techno leaning, at We Are Unterstrom on Instagram. And I think those are usually the default places folks can find me on. Yeah.
Fantastic. I'll put those links in the episode description. And audience listening, if you're not familiar with the New Division, go check out Argyle. It's there's a vocal sample in that. I think it's a vocal sample. It might actually be a vocalist, but it's such a cool sample, and it inspired me this week to think, you know what, I'm going to find something like that myself in the track that I'm working on in a few weeks. I wish I could timestamp the sample I'm thinking of, but I can't. Can't think of it.
Was it like the little lead one on the choruses maybe or something?
I think so. It's not actual words. It's just like a...
It's like a...
that's the word. Yeah. I was going to try and sing it.
Yeah, I think it was just a one shot that I put on like a multi-sampler.
Nice. It's so cool. I was going to try and sing it then, but then I can't sing, man. I wish I could. Fantastic stuff, John. Thank you very much. Audience, Do go check those links in the episode description. And if you've picked up one tip that you're going to take forward today, consider supporting Inside the Mix on Patreon. You'll unlock exclusive extras, and help us keep bringing these conversations every week as well. So you can click the link in the episode description and you can join for free. John, it's been a pleasure again. Thank you so much for taking the time out today to chat with me. And we'll catch up again soon.
Thanks for having me.
No worries. Until next time, folks, stay inspired, keep creating, and don't be afraid to experiment inside the mix.